Our first speaker is Claire Essex from Birkbeck, University of London.
Hi, good evening. So I'm Claire, I'm a PhD student in my final year at the Centre for Brain and Cognitive Development. I'm supervised by Tim Smith and Taya Gilger, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of my findings from my PhD. I've been investigating the short-term impact of children's TV viewing on some of the aspects of their emerging attention control. So just to give a really quick overview, I'm just going to give a brief bit of background on the current evidence of effects of TV viewing on children's attention skills, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the stimuli that we created in order to test for short-term impacts of TV viewing, and also a bit about the experimental design more generally. I just wanted to highlight for you that I'm just talking about one task today, but I have a battery of tasks, so we have a range of pre- and post measures of attention and learning, which we built around the TV viewing aspects of the design. I'm going to talk a bit about the results that we've got from this first task, but they're very much a work in progress, so I welcome any comments or suggestions that you might have. Okay, so there's a mixed picture surrounding children's media use. There's concerns about the pervasiveness of media use, particularly in very young children. And the possible consequences that it might have for development. And this has led to some recommendations for parents to limit screen time, particularly during early childhood. But survey data is still showing that there's an increase in the amount of screen time that children are having. And this is at odds with the recommendations, but also with some of the evidence that exists in the literature, which appears to show that there's an association between the time that children spend viewing media and the difficulties that they might experience with maintaining attention, suppressing unnecessary distractors, and rising to the demands placed on them in the classroom. But these findings have been inconclusive, and some studies have failed to replicate the associations. And they point to a sort of more mixed picture in terms of family background media, so more to do with background TV potentially, or co-viewing habits, so viewing with grown-ups. And it also seems to be associated with very high levels of TV viewing. So while this evidence has been quite mixed, there are a couple of prominent empirical studies which have looked at the short-term impact of viewing TV on children's executive functions. And these have been done by Lillard and colleagues, and they seem to show that for some children, their executive function performance is reduced after viewing some types of TV content, but not others. And this has been attributed to sort of very formal features of the content, so things like pace, so how fast the content's delivered, and this is often to do with the rate of cuts that the TV shows have, or more general content features such as fantastical events. And these are the things that I'm going to focus on in my talk today. So Lillard and colleagues defined these events as things which violated physical laws, and I've put some examples here in this cartoon. So these are basically widely used in children's TV, probably because they're quite entertaining, but also because of the way they combine the sort of low-level feature changes with the novelty of fantastical events. They're also going to be highly captivating. So in the studies by Lillard and colleagues, they seem to isolate their short-term effects to these fantastical events, and they propose two non-mutually exclusive hypotheses for what might drive these effects. So the first of these is to do with a bias towards exogenous drivers within the content. So they say that the novelty of the fantastical events is going to bias the viewer to process the content in a bottom-up fashion, and this is going to limit their practice of endogenous attention. And this is problematic because endogenous attention is going to be key if you're trying to then deploy your behavior in a goal-directed manner on tasks that follow your viewing. Or their second hypothesis is that the effects lie further up a processing stream when the cognitive resources of the viewer are exhausted trying to understand these unfamiliar events. But we feel that there's gaps in the reasoning for both of these hypotheses. So just to flag these, we think that in the first hypothesis, they're really talking about the long-term effects of viewing these types of TV shows. While in the second hypothesis, they're sort of neglecting the role that the higher order processes are going to play in terms of the bias towards exogenous drivers of attention. So we think that we're proposing a more coherent account for short-term effects, so I mean in the actual viewing itself, and then mid-term effects that are on subsequent tasks. We say that fantastical events are problematic because the violations of expectation are going to require the viewer to reassess their knowledge. This can disrupt the semantic thread of the content, which is going to make it more difficult to abstract higher level information. And we think that this can have two consequences for children as they're watching them. So they may attempt to update their knowledge, so to make sense of what they're seeing, which is in itself cognitively demanding, but they're also going to try to figure out the violation, and by doing so, they're going to miss new events, which is going to further disrupt their narrative understanding of what they're watching. So as more of these events accumulate during a TV show, the effort to make sense of the content is going to take away from attention that they may need to be successful on subsequent tasks. Another consequence is that children may just give up on processing these high-level aspects of the content and instead focus on more low-level visual features. And in addition, these events are cognitively alerting, so they signal a sort of novel, volatile environment. And this can also increase vigilance, which is then associated with more bottom-up attention. So this can also last beyond the exposure to the content. So we're suggesting that both increased stimulus-driven attention and difficulties attending to the higher level structures could be evident following exposure to these types of cartoons. And so to test this, we've devised a within subjects match content design. So we're using cartoons we've created ourselves, which I'll show you in a minute. So we have two sets of cartoons, and they were created from Looney Tunes cartoons. And the fantastical clips are matched with the non-fantastical clips, so they come from the same episode. So just to show you the fantastical first. And so we also have then the non-fantastical, which looks like this. And so in each video condition, we have 8 clips that are like this, and we show the video blocks 3 times during a testing session. Sorry. If I move on, it might stop. Okay, and so we also pseudo-randomized the ordering of these clips, so we were preventing children being able to anticipate the fantastical events across the repeated blocks. And so then, in order to test the short-term impact, we used a gaze contingent anti-saccade task, which I'm just going to walk you through really quickly. And so basically, the gaze contingency in this task is essentially helping children to learn to look towards a reward target and to ignore a distractor. We use this task because it's able to tap exogenous attention and endogenous attention, so it lends itself really well to disentangling the levels at which fantastical events may impact children's attention control. And so for anybody who doesn't know, you basically see a central stimulus, and once the children look at that, it triggers the start of the trial. A distractor will show on one side of the screen, and at the offset of that distractor, you then see a target on the opposite side of the screen, so it's just showing you now. So they get rewarded when they arrive at this target side. And what we get is different behaviors across the task. So you'll get, if they anticipate the reward location without looking towards the distractor, this is an anti-saccade. If they look to the distractor without making an anticipatory look to the target, then this is a pro-saccade. And we also have corrective looks. So this is when they can look to the distractor but still anticipate the target and get there in time to get the reward. So our exogenous measure of attention is a pro-saccade, and our endogenous attention is an anti-saccade. Okay, so we have two hypotheses that we're exploring with this task. So the first of these is that fantastical content will impair goal-driven executive processing, and we expect fewer anti-saccades to be made after viewing the fantastical condition. And then we have a second one, which is that the fantastical content will increase sensitivity to the exogenous drivers of attention, and here we expect faster latencies to look to the distractor during the pro-saccades. Thanks. So really quickly, just the methods. So we had 36 children who were 18 months old. They visited Birkbeck Baby Lab twice. We showed them these cartoons, and we interspersed it with the 4 blocks of anti-saccade. We counterbalanced across visits for the order of the videos and also for the side of the target and the reward. We tested our behaviors with generalized estimating equations. So I'm going to start by talking about the saccade behaviors. So we first confirmed that the conditions were matched at baseline. So this is previewing, and that was in all saccade types. And we used the number of valid trials as a test of data quality. So this showed an effective block with the number of valid trials. So we've used that as a covariate in our analysis. We've baselined all of our scores to account for their previewing performance, subtracting the baseline score from the proportion of saccade behavior in each of the blocks. And we first tested the impact of goal-driven attention by entering condition and block as predictors of the proportion of anti-saccades. Here we found fewer anti-saccades were made in the fantastical condition, but this didn't reach significance. We found a main effect of block with the proportion of anti-saccades increasing, but a condition by block interaction showed that this effect was driven by an increase in the non-fantastical condition. So the children, when they saw the fantastical condition, didn't have this increase in anti-saccades across the blocks. So we found support here for our first hypothesis, which was that fantastical content would impair goal-driven executive processing. So now just to talk about the exogenous attention. So here again, we used generalized estimating equations to test this. We found a significant effect of condition. So they were faster to look to the distractor during pro-saccades when they'd seen the fantastical content. We found no effect of block and no condition by block interaction either. When we break down this condition effect that we found, when we check within each block, there is a difference at baseline which is approaching significance. This moves to highly significant in block 2, and there's no significant difference in block 3 or block 4. So we found some support for a short-term impact on exogenous attention, but the difference at baseline is tricky here. So just to summarize, we found support for our first hypothesis, which is expected the negative impact on endogenous attention. And the fact that this emerged from an interaction between block and condition appears to suggest that the impact was on the learning of the task or a sort of learning to succeed at the task. And this was only present when they saw the fantastical videos. But while we're detecting that there's a failure on the task, what we can't say at this point is whether it was an issue to do with learning quite a subtle rule of the task, so how to get the reward quicker, or whether it was an issue with inhibiting the influence of the distractor. So we also had some evidence for the short-term impact on exogenous attention, as I mentioned. But it wasn't sustained across the block, so there was an initial speeded advantage, but as I talked about, our difference at baseline makes this difficult to interpret. A previous study did find a general advantage on exogenous attention for children who have higher touchscreen use, but this manifested slightly differently on this task, so they were able to look to the distractor and still reach the target. So it was a general overall advantage, which we don't see on our task. So I'll be really quick. We've replicated the existing findings and which were found for school-age children, and we've extended them to toddlers. We believe that by matching the content and using the within-subjects design shows that the effects are specific to the fantastical events and not other confounding aspects of the TV shows. But further work's needed to understand the mechanisms which were underlying this in the short term, and also whether these effects are sustained in the mid to long term. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of the families for taking part.
Thank you, Claire. We have some time for questions. I see one over here.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether this effect is specific to the format that you're using. Do you think if you, rather than doing the test on the screen, you were doing like a natural interaction, the effect will be similar? So it's like something that goes deep on the brain, like when you see this kind of stimuli, or it's that maybe based with the assumption that, oh, if I cannot understand things on the TV, what's happening, then the next thing I'm not going to do the anticipation in the same way.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So I think, firstly, I think this kind of thing we see across a lot of different tasks, right? So not only when you're looking at TV viewing, we see it in sort of violation of expectation studies, which also normally test it as a screen-based paradigm. So I think definitely screen-based. I wonder if you transferred it to more, I know that some people have done some work with sort of storytelling and how it looks if you have a fantastical story, and the effects were much less certain. So I think it is more tricky when you put it into another domain, because I think, like I talked about it at the beginning, it's sort of a combination of the featural changes that the TV shows are using to like achieve the effects, as well as the fact that they're sort of implausible. Thanks.
Are there more questions? I'm saying Geiger's showing someone at the back. Maybe you can help me out. Yeah.
Hi. So really interesting. So I'm wondering about whether. So we heard a talk earlier today about the effects of humor on infants' learning, and I'm wondering if there's any differences you saw in affective response depending on the fantastical versus not fantastical clip, particularly in this age group where I don't know if there's actually been any work done on that, like how they respond to things that are, whether they think they're funnier, basically.
Yeah, sorry, can you just repeat the last bit? I couldn't quite hear you.
Whether the affective response to the fantastical clips is different than it is to the non-fantastical clips from the same material. So whether this could partially be explained by just different arousal states or something.
Yeah, so we wanted to include a measure of arousal because we wonder whether there is something about that. So in the fantastical clips, they're generally, this is my interpretation, they're probably, I feel that they're more arousing than the non-fantastical, and so that's definitely something that we should look to try and clarify about these clips. So I think it's definitely a really valid point. I also think there's something about the music, and there's still an intensity. So even though they're matched in terms of cut rate and things, there's still an intensity difference, I think. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Let me ask one then. So I was wondering, so it's not so much that the fantastic cartoons like were bad for infants' performance, it's just that the non-fantastic ones improved their performance. And
yeah, I guess that's one way to think about it. Generally, so on this task, we see, so when you're not trying to manipulate what you've shown the children, generally they get better with the task as it progresses because it's got this learning element. So I think one interpretation is that there's a benefit of not seeing the fantastical, but I think the other version is that the fantastical has prevented the children being able to employ that same learning strategy potentially. So it's blocked that ability. I don't know, we still need to find out.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.